Hello, and welcome to this lecture on spheres, ecosystems, and biomes. The Earth's system is made up of many different interacting parts. Everything can be placed into one of the four major subsystems. The lithosphere consists of land or solid Earth. The hydrosphere is all the water on the planet. The biosphere consists of all the living things on the Earth, and the atmosphere is all the air and gases. The variables within these spheres interact to create the different ecosystems on Earth. So what is an ecosystem? An ecosystem is the sum of all the abiotic and biotic factors within an area. These pictures give you examples of the abiotic and biotic variables within an ecosystem. Ecologists study ecosystems, and ecology is the study of how organisms interact with each other and their environment. So we have defined an ecosystem, but let's define the other levels of ecological organization. An organism is a single individual. It is a complete living thing, but just one. A population is a group of organisms that are all the same species that live together, interacting and potentially interbreeding. So humans within a town or state or country or the world are all part of the same population, depending on the level of interaction you are going for, but humans and their pets are not part of the same population because they are different species. A community incorporates all the different populations within an area. The different populations within a community potentially interact. Now, the ecosystem consists of the community of organisms in addition to the abiotic parts of that environment. Biomes are ecosystem types. Similar ecosystems are often found in like climates, and we characterize terrestrial biomes by the vegetation types that grow within them. Finally, the biosphere consists of all the living things on Earth. Here we are actually defining it as the entire habitable Earth, whereas earlier we defined the biosphere as living organisms on Earth. Don't worry too much about the distinction, except that there are certain parts of the Earth that are uninhabitable. So we know what makes up an ecosystem, but what shapes the abiotic portion of the environment? There are two main drivers, climatic forces and geologic forces. Let's start by clarifying what climate is, because a lot of people confuse it with weather. Climate is an established pattern of weather over a long period of time for a large regional area. Climate is temperature and seasonal precipitation averaged over time and space. In the map, you can see different biomes represented by different colors, which are governed by differences in climate. By traveling to one of those biomes, you wouldn't know what the temperature would be on a particular day, but you would know a range that it would likely fall within. And that is why specific plants live there. Now, weather is the short-term, day-to-day, or even hour-to-hour variation of the condition of the atmosphere for a localized area. When you watch the news and they report the temperature and how much rain your town received, that's the weather. You know whether or not you should carry an umbrella when watching the weather. Ultimately, the reason for different climates on different parts of the planet are due to the sun. Solar radiation hits the Earth and heats it, and also sets air masses in motion in the atmosphere. The Earth is a globe, and because of that, the sun heats Earth unevenly. At the equator, solar radiation comes from directly overhead, while it comes in at a different angle at higher latitudes. Consequently, the equator gets more sun per unit area than higher latitudes, where the same amount of sun is spread out over a larger area. Solar radiation also has to travel through more of the Earth's atmosphere at higher latitudes. Because of these factors, the equator warms up more than higher latitudes. This creates an energy imbalance, and the Earth's system seeks to rectify that imbalance through its interacting spheres, specifically its atmosphere and its hydrosphere. We can't forget about Earth's tilt, which gives the Earth its seasons at higher latitudes. During summer months, higher latitude locations receive sun for a majority of the day, while higher latitude regions receive sun for a minority of the day during winter months. This creates a seasonal imbalance and distinct seasonal variation. But let's get back to the differential heating of the Earth by the sun between the equator and higher latitudes. This differential sets up global winds, precipitation patterns, and differences in ocean circulation, which govern many of the abiotic factors that make up ecosystems. Let's look at how differential heating does this. We've established that the equator gets more sun per unit area and heats up more than higher latitudes. Well, hot air absorbs moisture, which it gets from the ocean and other sources, and it also rises. So moist air masses at the equator rise up in the atmosphere. That is shown in the picture on the right. We can see ascending air, and as it rises higher into the atmosphere, it cools and condenses, causing the moisture that it holds to rain out. That is why the tropics are so rainy, in addition to warm. So reaching a certain altitude, this air mass either moves to the north or south, to higher latitudes. This is visualized in both figures. Then at 30 degrees north or south latitude, the air descends. As it does so, it heats up and sucks up any available moisture. Deserts occur at 30 degrees north or south latitude because warm descending air makes them very dry. Once the air mass gets close to the ground, it either travels back toward the equator, completing that air circulation convection cell, or goes on to higher latitudes and starts another convection cell. A similar rainout effect happens at 60 degrees north and south latitude, though it isn't as warm. These regions still have rainforests, they're just not tropical rainforests. Then the poles have descending air masses, like at 30 degrees north and south latitude, and they are very, very dry, though they are much colder, because they are polar. So those are the large-scale convection cells. The figure on the left also shows surface level winds, as the orange arrows. The trade winds blow toward the equator and west, and come from either northeast or southeast. This is governed by the convection cell. You can see that the cell is traveling back towards the equator over this latitudinal band. It's also governed by the fact that the Earth is rotating. See the green arrow at the bottom of the screen if you aren't sure which direction the Earth rotates. It's also deflected to the west due to something called the Coriolis effect. The ocean and atmosphere are connected through evaporation and condensation. The atmosphere absorbs water from the ocean via evaporation. Winds carry it to other latitudes, and then the water condenses and rains out, moving heat and water around the globe. The water moves heat via its high specific heat capacity, which means that it takes a lot of energy to heat up or cool down water. It also moves fresh water around. The larger figure is very similar to the previous one, showing the convection cells, but what is nice is that it shows the climatic conditions you would expect for distinct latitudinal bands. I added the figure in the upper right corner so you could see the major wind patterns again. But the ocean does its share of heat moving too, given that it is completely made up of water, which has such a high specific heat capacity. The main difference is that it moves slower than air masses. You can see the major surface currents in the ocean. There are actually many, many more, but these are the major ones, and they follow the circular pattern that are called gyres. The arrows show the direction that water is moving, and whether it's warm water, red, or cool water, blue. Water that was recently in contact with the equator is warmer and carries that warmer water to higher latitudes once it runs into a continent and is deflected poleward. Then water from higher latitudes carries cooler water to lower latitudes. The reasoning for the circular gyres has to do with the Coriolis effect again. The major terrestrial biomes on the planet, which we'll talk about at length later in this lecture, are governed by precipitation and temperature patterns. The major terrestrial biomes are defined by their characteristic vegetation types, and so it makes sense that places with similar temperature and precipitation patterns would have very similar vegetation types. So we've spoken at length about how climate affects organisms and what factors govern climate. Let's switch gears to geologic factors that affect ecosystems. There are several ways that geology affects ecosystems, and the first one is via mountains. Mountains affect ecosystems two ways. The first is by controlling rain. The windward side, that's the side that the wind is traveling from, has atmospheric moisture, but this moisture is forced out of the air as it travels up and over the mountain because the air condenses and cools, causing the water to rain out on that side of the mountain. So the windward side of the mountain is lush and green. Now the leeward side of the mountain is in the rain shadow region. All the moisture is gone and the descending dry air warms up. Many deserts exist in the rain shadow regions of mountains. Nevada and Death Valley are in the rain shadow of the Sierra Nevada, for example. Here's the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Another way that mountains affect ecosystems is via temperature. Mountains are at different temperature depending on the elevation that you're at, with the coldest regions at highest elevations. Traveling up a tall mountain, you will pass through different regions with different vegetation adapted to the different temperature conditions and growing season windows. At higher elevations, they'll have snow for more and more of the year. Another way that geology affects ecosystems is through the formation of continents. Plate tectonics and continental drift govern the current and past orientation of the continents. Temperature and precipitation patterns differ depending on whether you're on the west coast, east coast, or the center of a continent. You can see that the biome on the east coast of the US is different from that of the west coast at the same latitude because the east coast is more humid and has different precipitation patterns because of that humidity. The age of the soil and the minerals within the soil both also affect ecosystems as well. Younger soil has more parent rock and less soil. Plants with complex root structures and burrowing animals will not be present without a substantial amount of soil. Over time, that rock will be weathered and made into soil, and that can support complex root systems and more diverse ecosystems. Additionally, different rock types source soils with different minerals that will be more or less suited to different plants. This map of California shows different rock types, defined by the processes that went into forming those rocks that have different combinations of minerals. Disturbance also affects ecosystems. There are many different types of disturbance, of which geologic forces can be one. For example, a volcanic eruption can decimate an ecosystem and take it back to a primary successional stage. Younger ecosystems look different than older ecosystems, and the process of species outcompeting and replacing one another as the ecosystem ages is called succession. Primary succession is when a disturbance takes the ecosystem back to bare rock. The only species that can colonize are things like lichen that can exist without soil. Over time, the lichens are replaced by small plants and then grasses. As more soil develops, shrubs and then trees can eventually colonize and outcompete the weedier grasses. This process continues until the climax community is reached. This process can take hundreds of years. Secondary succession commonly happens after things like fires. Though the ecosystem can look decimated, the soil remains, and so the successionary stages can progress much more quickly, and initial colonizers can immediately put out roots. So now we've talked about some of the most important abiotic factors within an ecosystem. Let's talk about the biotic factors within ecosystems now. Well, biotic organisms are extremely diverse, but all food webs can be discussed using this framework. It all starts with primary producers. Primary producers take solar radiation, CO2, water, and nutrients and turn it into organic matter. That means they turn it into living matter. Primary consumers eat primary producers, secondary consumers eat primary consumers, and so on. Only about 10% of the biomass is transferred from one trophic level to the next, so an ecosystem needs the greatest number of primary producers, since everything can be traced back to primary producers, and then primary consumers will be the next greatest group, and so on. Decomposers are responsible for consuming all the trophic levels and turning their organic matter back into inorganic nutrients to fuel primary production. So here are the important terms you need to know. Primary producers complete photosynthesis. Everything that isn't a primary producer is a secondary producer. Primary consumers are herbivores. That means they devour plants. Secondary consumers and greater are carnivores. That means they devour flesh. Omnivores devour all and feed from multiple trophic levels. Many carnivores occupy multiple trophic levels as well. Detritivores devour detritus and consume dead organic matter. Decomposers decompose organic matter and turn it back into inorganic nutrients for primary producers. So now we've talked about what goes into ecosystems. Let's talk about ecosystem types. Recall that major biomes of the planet are made up of very similar ecosystems. Terrestrial ecosystems are grouped into similar types based on the vegetation type, which is largely controlled by climate. Climate is an established pattern of weather over a long period of time for a large regional area. Climate is temperature and seasonal precipitation averaged over time and space, so we show what biomes exist for different combinations of temperature and precipitation. For example, tropical rainforests are warm and receive a lot of rain, while tundra ecosystems are very cold and dry. We're going to quickly go through the different biome types now. Pay attention to the vegetation in each picture and think about the climate conditions that set the stage for that vegetation type. I've also included a globe with the air mass convection cells so you can see what type of rainfall that area gets. Tropical forests occur in equatorial areas. They are very warm and receive high rainfall. Because they are equatorial, there isn't very much seasonal variation. Savannas are dominated by grasses and scattered trees. They are warm year-round and experience only 12 to 20 inches of rain per year. The rainfall is highly seasonal. Because of the dramatic seasonal rainfall, fire can be common during the dry season. Deserts are the driest of all biomes and are characterized by low, unpredictable rainfall. The Great Deserts occur at 30 degrees north and south latitude, and because their temperatures are not moderated by water, they can get very hot and they can also get very cold at night in the winter. The chaparral biome is the result of cool ocean currents circulating offshore and producing mild rainy winters and hot dry summers. Fire is a large threat in chaparral biomes, and much of California is actually a chaparral biome. Temperate grasslands are mostly treeless biomes that exist in temperate regions. Temperate means distinct seasons. They get low rainfall that is highly seasonal, and thus drought and fires are common. A significant amount of North America consists of temperate grasslands, and it supports grazers such as bison and pronghorn. Temperate broadleaf forests consist of deciduous trees, and they drop their leaves before winter. They do this because temperatures become too low for the tree to effectively carry out photosynthesis, and because water lost by evaporation is not easily replaced from frozen soil. You may notice that a significant portion of the east coast of the US and a lot of Europe is made up of this type of biome. This biome gets more rainfall than grasslands or chaparral, and that's why it supports trees. Sometimes called taiga, coniferous forests make up a highly seasonal biome that is dominated by cone-bearing evergreen trees. This is the largest terrestrial biome in terms of square acreage, or area. It is covered by snow for a significant portion of the winter, but the growing season is still long enough to support dense forests. Tundra covers expansive areas of the Arctic. It's characterized by permafrost, which means permanently frozen subsoil. Bitterly cold temperatures are also common, as are high winds. Even when the snow is gone, the subsoil is still frozen, and so the root systems of vegetation have to be very shallow. This biome also receives very little rain. It's similar to deserts in terms of its convection cell. The polar ice is a biome that covers the land at high latitudes north of the Arctic tundra in the northern hemisphere and in Antarctica in the southern hemisphere. Only a small portion of these land masses is free of ice or snow, even during the summer, and they receive very little precipitation. Some ecologists have even more biome designations, but in both situations, the governing factors are temperature and precipitation. So knowing differences in solar heating and season, the movement of rain patterns due to atmospheric convection cells and other factors, like how continents affect temperature, humidity, and rainfall, lets you identify biomes. Aquatic biomes are found all over the planet. Water covers about 75% of its surface. Many terrestrial ecologists divide aquatic biomes into either freshwater or marine ecosystems because most don't support vegetation types on which we can easily classify them. This division is incredibly short-sighted and does not do these ecosystems justice. Aquatic ecosystems are found at all latitudes, and, for the ocean, across more than 12,000 feet of depth. As such, they have incredible diversity. We'll start with the freshwater biome, which can be further divided into a few different categories. First is water that doesn't flow, like lakes and ponds, and second is water that flows, like rivers and streams. Freshwater ecosystems cover less than 1% of Earth's surface and contain 0.01% of its water. This is even though there are some vast lakes like the Great Lakes on this Earth. Despite their small volumes, these ecosystems harbor about 6% of all described species because all organisms need water, and where better to get it than to live within it? Humans have been tightly connected with freshwater ecosystems since our species got started. We use it for drinking, crop irrigation, sanitation, industry, and so on. Now, I'm making the case that freshwater biomes are even more distinct than just water that flows and doesn't flow because they cover a wide range of latitudes and elevations with vastly different temperatures and precipitation patterns. Additionally, for rivers, where you happen to be within a watershed has very different hydrological conditions. Headwaters in the source zone are very different from a transitional zone or from a floodplain. There is a different flow, volume of water, temperature, vegetation, animals, and so on. A wetland is another freshwater biome, and it's a transitional ecosystem between an aquatic ecosystem and a terrestrial one. Wetlands support the growth of aquatic plants, and because they exist at an interface, are particularly rich in species diversity. Estuaries are a transitional area between a river and the ocean. Salt concentration ranges from that of nearly freshwater to that of the ocean, depending on where you are within the estuary. Again, these ecosystems exist at all latitudes, wherever rivers empty into the ocean, and so are vastly different. Estuaries have wetlands surrounding them, and many are among the most productive areas on Earth. They also host many different species, and many marine mammals use them as nursery grounds for their young because they're relatively protected. So now we're going to switch gears to marine ecosystems. First and foremost, marine biomes contain salt. Salinity is the amount of dissolved salt in the water and forms when rainwater dissolves rocks, releasing minerals into the water. The salt eventually washes out to the ocean, and when water evaporates from the ocean, the salt is left behind. Marine biomes are incredibly diverse, ranging from vivid coral reefs to perpetually dark realms of the deepest regions. In the photic zone, photosynthesis by phytoplankton and multicellular algae provides energy for a diverse community of animals throughout the water column. Marine ecosystems also differ with respect to their proximity to shore and/or the bottom. The pelagic realm is the open ocean. Benthic regions are along the bottom. Neritic regions are near the coast, overlying the continental shelf. The intertidal zone is affected by tidal flux and is sometimes submerged, sometimes uncovered. You can imagine that all of these extremely different conditions, whether or not organisms are exposed to the light, whether they are sometimes exposed to the air, whether they live on the bottom or they live in the open ocean, never running into a boundary of any kind, that all these conditions would have very different effects on the organisms that live within them, and different organisms would evolve differently in these different habitats. Marine ecosystems also vary according to latitude, which affects sea surface temperature, shown in this heat map, and according to factors such as currents, which affects temperature, nutrient concentrations, water movement, and more. The ocean is a huge and amazing place, and I hope you'll look more into some of the ecosystems that exist there. From the whale falls that become oases of life on the seafloor, to dense kelp forests and all the life that lives within them, to tropical coral reefs, which have been called rainforests of the sea, environmental conditions and the life histories of the organisms that make a living in these different marine environments are incredibly diverse. Thank you very much.